this is a whiteboard test that we have found, made by someone, Robert Yang. You'll see his name and his portfolio there at the bottom. This is a fantastic way just to evaluate where you're at with your map. So this is an iterative process. You'll have time after the rough to make improvements and make it better for the final. And this is a great way to evaluate where you are. And also we can talk about these types of things as some basic level design concepts and principles, right? So I know this is a new task for a lot of you, right? Several of you have never made a level before, and some of you that have, maybe you haven't gone this level of extensive detail to plan it before you actually just jump in the editor and start building things. So I never see levels that are like this, that are just look like chicken scratch with, I barely see these, to where there's just unorganized shapes that and these structures are just overly complicated. There's no path in place. There's no flow. Nothing that breaks the line of sight, right? That's really important for us in level design, is to break the line of sight. Don't let the player just see across the level. Make them move. Make them turn the camera. Make sure that they can't just see on forever. And there's just overall just a mess, right? I don't really ever see this very often, and I don't expect anyone to be at this level right now. If you are, that's okay, right? We have time to improve to each category, but this is where I see most students fall into the first attempt at their level, right? This intermediate category. So the first thing that you can notice about intermediate is everything will feel very boxy. Right? Everything is made out of squares and cubes and 90-degree angles, and it fits very much into a literal floor plan. So I definitely encourage everybody to use blueprints. Right? If you want to make a house, right? You want your level to be set in a mansion, go onto Google and search mansion blueprint. Look at some of the blueprints of the existing buildings and use that as a starting point or as a base to be inspired or motivated by, right? But because we're in games, we don't want everything to be specifically literal like that, right? It feels unimaginative, right? That key word right there. Unimaginatively breaks line of sight, right? And that's just by 90-degree turns and hallways and just very literal correlation. So this happens a lot of times with students, to where I did it myself plenty of times as a student when I was working on learning how to paint textures and model, to where you're being very literal into what you're creating. Exactly what you're seeing, you're reproducing over on the other side. But what you want to start to do is, because we're in a game, because we have this environment to be creative and we can break away from realism, we want to do that. Right? There's a good concept that I like to use. You'll see it in the common mistakes. It's called believability versus realism. So rather than making everything be extremely 100% realistic, we just want it to be believable by the player. One great example of this was, I had a student I'd working very closely with, and he was making a level that was set on a ship, and this ship had it was like a Navy ship, and it had this room that was a bunch of control panels and stations that he had a blueprint that he was starting to base it off of, right? And you could see in the floor plan that it was very realistic, right? There was these consoles that were spaces for people to walk through. It felt very much like it existed, but it wouldn't be conducive for a game because there was no direct path for the player to take. Something along the lines like this, but more of a detailed blueprint to where you could see each individual console. So my suggestion was to maybe have some of those machines tipped over, some of them are destroyed, to create a natural linear path for the player to take. And the first response that I had gotten was, well, they can't be tipped over because they were bolted to the ground. Right? They're bolted to the ground so they can't move. I'm like, well, okay, maybe there was a wrench laying next to it, and that's why they're tipped over, right? Now we have a reason. It's believable as to why they're tipped over. So he was in the mindset thinking so realistic that he didn't use the medium that we're using, which is a game, to break that reality and make it interesting. So the other side of that, another example of believability versus realism, was a student asked me, can I have a giant marshmallow in my level? And I said, a giant marshmallow? What do you mean, a giant marshmallow? He goes, I said, where did this giant marshmallow come from? What's the point of it? How does it fit within scraps? And he goes, okay, well, you see, there was this candy factory that experimented with a new type of sweetener, and when they added it to their current marshmallow product, it caused a radioactive result, and no one knew about it, so they shipped out the product, and everybody ate it, and everyone started to becoming rabid and hurting each other, and there was a chaos broke out, and the apocalypse started, and now this marshmallow started to grow and overwhelm, and the factory got taken over, and I'm like, okay, stop. You've got a good idea. You've got a plan. Go with it, right? So he had a reason why that marshmallow existed. He made it believable to the player and could immerse the player, and the player could buy into it, right? That's the biggest thing as a designer. If the player buys into what it is you're doing and you don't break that immersion, then that's okay. That's acceptable. So think about it that way, right? We can take these literal floor plans and take real life as a starting point, but then we can use the environment and use the game itself as a teaching tool or as ways to be creative and make things more interesting. So talking about making things more interesting, going into advanced and expert. All right? So advanced, I like to make the joke here that this is usually where students will discover the 45-degree angle, because then from there everything will start to have a 45-degree angle to it, or angles will come into play, right? You can see here's an example of that. So rather than having just a square hallway, we have, an angle. And what these are good for is starting to shift the player's perspective in the camera, right? So by having this at an angle, we could have an object right here, and the player's eye is just naturally going to be drawn to it because the perspective lines are drawing the player's eye that direction. Right? Another great way to differentiate between intermediate and advanced is a good mix of narrow versus open differentiation. Right? So having small sections, and there is some of that in here, right, where you have a spot where there's a smaller, tighter corridor or tighter hallway with some gameplay, and then you come around the corner and there's a larger open space. And I don't mean open as in free roam, go anywhere, but you can make it feel open with the geometry, right? You come around the corner and you can just see the expansive space off in the distance. You still might only have the path to come through here, but it feels open in terms of actual physical space, right? The very first world you'll see here is simpler, right? Oftentimes, the advanced layouts and the expert layouts can be oftentimes simpler and more memorable, right? Because they are cleaner and more interesting, it makes for something that's definitely more memorable. So this right here is a lot of hallways and connected pieces and almost overcomplicated structures that could be organized in a cleaner, more logical way. Definitely into advanced is a nice mix of height. Right, this is where height really starts to come into play, and it's definitely something that's not required for the map, but I encourage everybody to think about that, to using it to your advantage. Because we're a 3D game, right, and the player can jump, and they can climb, or they can use the grab null to climb up to higher points, and you can use elevators and things. Adding height into the game, adding verticality, really increases the interest in the gameplay. Rather than just walking around on the ground floor, you can jump up onto objects, drop down from higher points down to lower points. Using verticality to our advantage can make the level design feel much more interesting. All right? Then breaking into expert, right? Really how you start to differentiate advanced from expert is this keyword right here is tells a story. Right? And we know now that game designers aren't creative writers, they aren't storytellers, right? But what we mean by this is the overall geometry of the level communicates the vision and communicates what happened in this space. So Going back, another student example, just real quickly. As a student that was building a four-story building was the setting for his level, and there was a crane, excuse me, not crane, a plane that had crashed into the ceiling or the rooftop of this building. This plane was carrying chemicals, right? This green toxic waste, and it had crash landed into this building. So on the top floor there was damage and broken debris, and it was shattered, and the liquid was starting to almost make a waterfall effect and drip into the third floor. So he was being very, very strategic and thinking about, okay, if my damage source is coming from the ceiling, how would it naturally form, or where would it go from here? So it was having this waterfall effect dripping from the fourth floor onto the third floor. It started to collect and gather in the third floor, and then there was a broken section in that floor, and it dropped all the way down into the lobby, the main first floor, and was really starting to pool and collect. So on the first floor, it felt very flooded, and there was a lot of this waste and liquid you had to avoid and take damage. And as you went up the floors, you could see it in other places, but it was all connected. You could tell right from the first floor, you could look up and see the crashed plane and see that same damage source affecting the whole level. So just by looking at it, you could tell that something crash landed in here, and it was spewing out this damage over the whole building. So just that alone, right? Little bits of information, how you can make the environment communicate things about what happened. All right, other thing about expert, it can break away from that traditional build, right? So there's clear research of real life buildings, but it's different, right? It tells that story. There's some careful use of symmetry, as well as some abstract things that might not actually exist in regular real life architecture, right? So here we have some of these off 15 or 30 degree angles. Here we have a circular building, right? Here's this like half curve. I definitely encourage everyone to play with these types of ideas, play with rooms at angles or rooms at a curve. It can lead you to different things, and again can allow the gameplay to be slightly different based on how the camera is starting to be pointed and transitioned through the level based on how everything is laid out. So after you do your first pass, definitely you can come back to this video or check this video out and actually see where you lie, right? Am I falling into the intermediate category? Am I just starting into advanced? And then maybe you can come up with some ideas to how you can push yourself into that next category. And down below here's some great examples of what these are, right? So yeah, these beginners scratched on the back of your history textbook. These are some great, older deathmatch type games like Half-Life, Quake. I also would put into this category where these, very boxy floor plans, but definitely exist within games for sure. Advanced, you start to see, more recent games, more sci-fi, pure gameplay-based levels. A lot of the Halo levels you could fit into here, the earlier games, and then moving up to like CS:GO, Uncharted. Some of the more recent shooters, really complicated and complex structures, are really starting to push into that next category. So a really, really good test just on one slide to see the progression of your level from one stage to the next.